Did you know that during the American Revolution, more patriots actually died rotting away in the suffocating hulls of British prison ships anchored in New York Harbor than were ever killed by a British musket ball on an actual battlefield?
I mean, it's a staggering statistic, really, and it completely shatters that pristine imagery we usually associate with the founding of the United States.
Exactly. Yeah. Usually when we think about the story of this nation's founding, there's this expectation of like pristine clarity.
Oh, for sure. The textbook paintings, the immaculate uniforms.
Right. The noble poses, those straight lines of infantry. It all just seems so inevitable. Like our history neatly categorized in these heroic chapters.
Oh, we do, yeah.
But then you step into the actual historical source material we have today, which is this towering stack of research offering a really comprehensive overview of the Revolutionary War. And suddenly that marble monument starts to crack. We're looking at a historical landscape that is, well, it's incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of muddy waters. When you really dig into the sources we're looking at, that clean binary narrative, the good guys versus bad guys, freedom versus tyranny, it just completely falls apart.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission for you is to look way past that simplified version of the American Revolution. We want to uncover the real aha moments of this conflict.
Because it really wasn't just this localized fight for liberty.
No, not at all. Because what we found in these sources is that this was actually a massive, sprawling global proxy war. It was a brutal civil war among neighbors and just an unmitigated logistical nightmare.
And honestly, understanding that complexity is the key to understanding how history actually works. It is infinitely more messy than the myths suggest.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's set the stage with the economics, because this whole thing doesn't start with some grand philosophical declaration of a new nation.
Right.
It starts with a bill coming due.
Yeah.
So we're in 1763. Britain has just won the 7 Years' War against France. They're globally dominant, but they are drowning in debt.
Absolutely drowned.
Right, so Parliament looks across the ocean and decides, hey, the American colonies need to start footing the bill for their own defense. You get the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the explosive Boston Tea Party, and then the Intolerable Acts.
Which is crucial context here.
Yeah.
Because the conflict did not start as a quest for independence.
It didn't.
No, not at all. It began as a highly localized dispute over taxation, representation, and maybe most importantly, imperial trade rules.
Okay, trade rules like what?
Well, take the Molasses Act of 1733, for example. It had been on the books for decades, right? But it was routinely ignored by everyone.
Just totally bypassed.
Yeah, smuggled right past the customs agents. But when Britain suddenly decided to actually enforce those customs duties, it threatened the entire New England economy.
Wow.
I mean, think about it. 85% of New England's rum exports were manufactured from imported molasses. So the colonists were fighting to preserve their economic livelihoods and their local political autonomy. They weren't trying to create the United States yet.
Right. But that political friction, it quickly ignites into a military reality. Because in April 1775, British troops march out to seize militia weapons at Concord, and we get the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord.
The famous shot heard round the world.
Exactly. And then follows the incredibly bloody Battle of Bunker Hill. Yeah. And this is where the sheer audacity of the Patriot cause really hits you.
Yeah.
You have a loosely connected group of colonies attempting to fight the world's greatest superpower.
And doing so without a professional army or navy, which is just, it's wild to think about.
Yeah.
In 1775, the Continental Congress officially adopts the militia surrounding Boston, and they appoint George Washington to lead them. He walks into a situation where he has to somehow professionalize a severely underfunded, poorly trained group of local militias.
Right, you want to go home, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're accustomed to serving for only a few weeks or maybe months at a time before going back to their farms.
And the naval disparity is even wilder. Congress established a Continental Navy, but it was basically just a handful of small frigates and sloops.
They couldn't possibly match the Royal Navy ship for ship. It was mathematically impossible.
So they relied heavily on privateers. The sources show Congress commissioned around 1,700 privateer ships. Essentially, they decentralized the naval war.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is the economic mechanism behind that strategy. Privateering was essentially state-sanctioned piracy driven by a pure profit motive.
Like a side hustle for sailors.
Exactly. A ship owner would get a letter of marque from Congress allowing them to legally attack British shipping. If they captured a British merchant vessel, they brought it to a prize court, sold the cargo, and split the profits among the crew and the investors.
Wow, so it was basically a business.
It utilized the greed of roughly 55,000 colonial sailors to disrupt British supply lines, all entirely off the books of the struggling Continental Congress. They captured over 2,200 British vessels this way.
That is incredible. And that economic decentralization brings up a concept I want to throw at you.
Yeah.
Because we have this traditional idea of Washington as this flawless battlefield tactician.
Right, the guy on the white horse.
Yeah, exactly. But looking at the numbers, he actually lost more pitched battles than he won. It reminds me a lot of a modern tech startup employing the Fabian strategy. Washington wasn't trying to win every battle. He was just trying not to go bankrupt. His whole goal was simply outlasting the British will to fight, right?
I mean, let's be precise about what a Fabian strategy actually entails, because the startup analogy only works if we define the terms.
Okay, lay it on me.
It's named after the Roman dictator Fabius Maximus, who realized he couldn't beat Hannibal in a head-to-head fight. Therefore, he harassed Hannibal's supply lines and just avoided major engagements entirely to wear him down through attrition.
Exactly. So taking that to the startup analogy, it's like a scrappy new company facing a legacy monopoly. You don't take them on by launching a competing flagship product and outspending them on marketing.
Because that's a pitched battle you will lose.
Right. You bleed their runway by targeting their vulnerable supply chains and just surviving long enough for their investors to get restless and pull the funding.
Viewed through that lens, yeah, it is a very fitting analogy. Washington realized early on, particularly after a really disastrous defeat in New York where he lost 3,000 prisoners at Fort Washington, he realized his primary objective was just preservation.
Just keeping the lights on.
Basically, yeah. The Continental Army was the revolution. If the army dissolved, the cause died. And by late 1776, his forces had dwindled to fewer than 5,000 men. The cause was on the brink of total collapse.
Which forces his hand into launching one of his most famous yet precarious operations. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington executes this highly dangerous crossing of the icy Delaware River.
The logistics of that crossing are often totally glossed over in the paintings. Imagine trying to move thousands of poorly clothed men, horses, heavy artillery across a river choked with jagged ice floes.
In the dead of night.
In the dead of night during a freezing nor'easter. But he does it, and he surprises the Hessian forces at Trenton. In terms of actually capturing territory, it was insignificant. He only took about 900 prisoners.
But as a morale booster,
Oh, as a proof of concept, it was vital. It proved the Continental Army could execute a complex offensive operation, and that reinvigorated enlistments just when they needed it most.
surviving wasn't just about retreating or launching desperate night attacks, though. The sources highlight that Washington was running a remarkably intricate intelligence network.
He really was.
Yeah, he spent over 10% of his total military funds on intelligence. He established the Army's first elite reconnaissance unit, Knowlton's Rangers, and launched the famous Culper spy ring.
And the mechanisms of that spy ring are extraordinary for the 18th century. They utilized dead drops in farm fields. They used complex numerical ciphers where specific numbers represented words.
Like real cloak and dagger stuff.
Literally, and invisible ink formulated by a doctor that required a specific chemical reagent to reveal. This wasn't just, tavern gossip. This was actionable intelligence regarding British troop movements and naval deployments in New York.
Which vastly improved how he deployed his outnumbered troops.
What's like,
And because Washington refused to give the British a decisive war-ending battle, the British command had to fundamentally change their approach. They realized they couldn't just chase him around New Jersey forever.
right, it was getting them nowhere.
So in 1777, they attempt a knockout blow. They decide to geographically isolate New England by sending General John Burgoyne south from Canada down the Hudson River Valley, anticipating another force would push north from New York to meet him.
And this is where the sheer friction of war completely derails British planning. Burgoyne's supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Local patriots fell trees across the roads, destroyed bridges. They literally stripped the surrounding land of forage.
A total nightmare for a marching army.
Meanwhile, General High, who was supposed to be supporting this broader strategy from the south, unilaterally decides to just sail off and capture Philadelphia instead.
Leaving Burgoyne completely stranded in the wilderness. And that leads to Saratoga in October 1777, where Burgoyne is surrounded and forced to surrender his entire army of over 6,000 troops.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Saratoga is the ultimate pivot point of the war. Its ripple effect was profound because it served as the ultimate proof of concept to the observing European powers.
It showed they could actually win.
It demonstrated that the Americans were a viable military force capable of capturing a standard British army.
Which brings the global heavyweights onto the board. I mean, France had already been secretly funneling weapons to the Americans through front companies and Dutch smugglers, right?
Yeah, laundering money and munitions to avoid open war.
But after Saratoga, they signed a formal treaty of alliance in 1778. They provide essential capital, weapons, naval support, and thousands of troops led by commanders like Lafayette and Rochambeau. Spain jumps in too, and they secure the Gulf Coast, with Bernardo de Galvez capturing Baton Rouge and Pensacola. Even the Dutch Republic scales up their carrying trade to supply munitions.
It really becomes a world war.
But if the French and Spanish were helping, what was the catch? They weren't doing this just out of the goodness of their hearts for American liberty, were they?
Not even slightly. And this raises an important question about global geopolitics at the time. For France and Spain, this was a golden opportunity to dismantle the British Empire and avenge their own humiliating territorial losses from the 7 Years' War a decade earlier.
So it was payback.
Exactly. Furthermore, France desperately wanted to protect its lucrative sugar islands in the West Indies.
Wait, the West Indies? Why was that the priority over North America?
Because of the sheer economics of sugar. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, produced more wealth than all 13 American colonies combined.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah. Spain, meanwhile, wanted to recover lost territories, like Gibraltar in Europe and Florida in America. The immense irony here is that the United States Congress had to promise not to make peace with Britain without French consent. So the American fight for independence became completely tethered to the imperial ambitions of the French and Spanish crowns.
So while the European powers are playing this grand game of chess on a global map, the reality on the ground back in America is deeply fractured. The sources show this wasn't just a unified populace throwing off the yoke of tyranny. It was a brutal, messy civil war among the colonists themselves.
The population was profoundly divided. Historians estimate that roughly 40% of the colonists were patriots, 20% were loyalists who actively supported the crown, and the remaining 40% just tried to keep their heads down and remain neutral.
Just trying to survive.
Exactly. And approximately 25,000 loyalists actually took up arms and fought for the British throughout the war.
And the British command tried to weaponize that division. They developed the Southern strategy, assuming there was this massive untapped well of loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia, but their execution was a disaster.
It backfired completely.
Right. They relied on hard war tactics, plundering local farms for supplies and executing prisoners. It just enraged the neutral population. It turned into vicious neighbor versus neighbor skirmishes, like the Battle of Kings Mountain in 1780, which was fought entirely between American patriots and American loyalists. There were virtually no British regulars on the field.
That internal fracturing extended to every demographic, deeply impacting the enslaved African-American population as well. Very early on, in 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation promising freedom to any patriot-owned slaves who would bear arms for the British. General Clinton later expanded this policy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, looking at the sheer contradictions of the era. You have the patriots demanding unalienable liberty while strictly maintaining the institution of slavery. And conversely, the British are offering freedom to enslaved people, but strictly as a military tactic to hurt patriot supply lines.
Right, it wasn't some grand abolitionist crusade.
Not at all. The sources show they made sure to return any runaway slaves that belonged to loyalists. It was purely a tactic to deprive patriot planters of their labor force.
It was entirely tactical, yes, but the demographic impact of it was staggering. Thomas Jefferson himself estimated that Virginia alone lost 30,000 enslaved people to escapes during the war. Eventually, out of a desperate need for manpower, Washington allows black soldiers into the Continental Army.
Like the 1st Rhode Island Regiment.
Exactly. Units like the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which included former slaves, fought incredibly valiantly for the Patriot cause.
Native American populations were similarly caught in the crossfire, too. The sources indicate most tribes viewed the expansionist American colonists as the primary threat to their lands, so an estimated 13,000 Native Americans fought for the British.
Which had huge consequences for them.
Yeah, the powerful Iroquois Confederacy was completely shattered, splitting allegiances between the British and the Americans.
And the retaliation from the Continental Army was devastating. Washington ordered the Sullivan Expedition, which was a scorched earth campaign that systematically destroyed over 40 Iroquois villages and burned their entire winter food supply. It created a catastrophic refugee crisis. The social fabric of the entire continent was just being torn apart.
It is staggering when you look at the human cost across all these different communities. But speaking of the human cost, we have to talk about the real enemy in this war. Because bullets and bayonets weren't actually the biggest threat to either side.
No, the true invisible killer was disease. As was typical for wars of this era, illness claimed vastly more lives than combat did. Between 1775 and 1782, an enormous smallpox epidemic swept across North America, killing an estimated 130,000 people.
130,000 deaths. That is an unbelievable number given the population size at the time. You mentioned earlier that Washington's primary goal was the preservation of his army. How do you preserve an army when they are crammed into unsanitary winter camps with a highly contagious, lethal virus spreading through the ranks?
You take a monumental medical gamble. Washington issued a critical, totally unprecedented order to systematically inoculate his troops against smallpox. And we have to remember, they didn't have a modern vaccine in a little vial. They
No.
used a process called variolation. Medical personnel would take a scalpel, slice into the arm of a healthy soldier, and literally insert live smallpox matter taken from the pustule of an infected patient.
Wow. That sounds incredibly dangerous. You are intentionally infecting your own soldiers with a deadly disease while actively trying to fight off the British Empire.
It was incredibly dangerous. The soldiers would get a milder case of the disease, requiring weeks of strict quarantine to ensure they didn't trigger a camp-wide outbreak, but they would emerge immune.
If they survived.
Right. And managing the logistics of secretly quarantining whole segments of your army so the British wouldn't realize how vulnerable you were, it's widely considered one of Washington's greatest logistical achievements of the entire war.
So the Americans are surviving disease, they're surviving the winter, and they are avoiding major set-piece battles. Meanwhile, the British are facing an absolute logistical nightmare of their own.
The geography alone was punishing.
Yeah, they are fighting an enemy 3,000 miles away across an ocean. The sources say it took 3 months for a written dispatch to travel from London to the commanders in the field. And they were entirely reliant on the Royal Navy to supply their troops with everything from gunpowder to flour.
Everything had to be shipped.
I compared the British strategy to trying to conquer a map. Unlike in Europe, where you capture the enemy's capital city as the war is over, the British captured New York, they captured Philadelphia, they captured Charleston.
And the Americans
Just retreated into the countryside, kept farming, and kept fighting. There was no single heart to stab.
This raises an important question. Was British defeat inevitable? Prior to 1778, perhaps not. But once France entered the war, the strategic geometry completely shifted for Britain.
Because now they have a global problem.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They suddenly had to defend against French fleets globally. They had to divert critical military resources away from the 13 colonies to the Caribbean to protect Jamaica and the sugar trade.
Because sugar was the real moneymaker.
Exactly. Suppressing the American rebellion went from being a localized police action to an unmanageable, financially crippling global distraction.
And the final blow comes when all these elements, the French alliance, Washington's strategic patience, and British miscalculation, they all converge perfectly at Yorktown in 1781. General Cornwallis marches his British army onto a peninsula in Virginia, waiting for the Royal Navy to extract him.
Which, to be fair, was standard operating procedure for the British up to that point. The Royal Navy had always been their get-out-of-jail-free card.
But not this time.
No. This time, Washington and the French General Rochambeau marched their combined armies south to besiege him by land.
And crucially, the French Navy, under Admiral de Grasse, intercepts the British fleet at the Battle of the Chesapeake. The British Navy is forced to retreat, so Cornwallis is left totally isolated by sea, trapped by the French fleet, and surrounded by a combined Franco-American army on land. He has absolutely no choice but to surrender.
That surrender at Yorktown effectively breaks the political will of the British Parliament to continue funding the war in North America. By 1783, we get the Treaty of Paris. Great Britain formally recognizes U.S. independence and cedes vast amounts of territory from the Atlantic all the way to the Mississippi River.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's summarize today's deep dive. The American Revolutionary War was an incredible feat of survival. It wasn't won simply by standing in straight lines and firing muskets in the name of liberty. It was won through covert espionage networks, vital foreign alliances driven by global economics, and a grueling war of attrition. And it was fought amidst a backdrop of a deeply divided population, rampant disease, and bitter civil war.
Understanding the true mechanisms of this history is a shortcut to being well informed about how modern nations are actually forged. They are rarely born through clean, ideologically pure battles. They are built through messy compromises, the pressures of global supply chains, and quite frankly, a staggering amount of human endurance.
And I want to leave you with a final, lingering question to mull over, drawn right from our source material today. The 1783 Treaty of Paris technically ended the war between Britain and the U.S., but the Native Americans, who had fought and bled throughout the conflict on both sides, were completely left out of those peace negotiations.
Completely erased from the tape.
The British simply handed over millions of acres of indigenous land to the Americans. Yet secretly, the British refused to abandon their frontier forts, and they continued supplying native tribes with weapons for decades.
It's a profound historical postscript, really.
So, did the Revolutionary War actually end in 1783? Or did the stroke of a pen in Paris simply morph the conflict into a brand new, unacknowledged century of warfare for the continent's original inhabitants? The marble monument is pristine, but the muddy reality of history just keeps flowing. Thank you so much for sharing your sources and taking this deep dive with us today.